A disk combiner is a program that allows us to combine a number of disks into one large disk. A client that uses the disk only sees one large disk. Let us look at how this combiner works. With a disk combiner, we start out with a number of disks. Let's symbolize a disk with a cylinder. So we have disk 0 here, disk 1, and disk 2. Let's have 3 disks in our example. A disk combiner is a program that sits between our client and our disks. So this is our combiner. It exposes a virtual disk. So let's symbolize a virtual disk with a dotted disk, because it isn't really a disk, but it looks like a disk to the client. So let's draw a dotted cylinder. So the combiner exposes the virtual disk. And we have a client over here that uses this virtual disk. Now, when the virtual disk starts up, when the disk combiner starts up, it needs to check the sizes of each of the disks and maintain these sizes in a table. So we have 3 physical disks, 0, 1, and 2. So the disk combiner asks the first disk, how large are you? And it answers back 100. The second disk answers 400. And the third disk 200. Now, when the client asks how large is the disk combiner will sum these sizes together and answer back 700. So from the client's perspective, it has access to a single disk that is 700 entries large. If the client now wants to read from the disk, he can issue a read command, read entry number, let's say 105. Then disk combiner will then look in the table and see that this isn't on the first disk. So it subtracts 100 from the number and gets 5. And 5 is clearly within the first disk here. So it issues a read command here on entry number 5. And it responds to the client. Let's do another example. Let's read 510. When the combiner gets this, it's not in the first disk, not in the second disk, in the third disk. And it's in entry number 10. And similar thing is done for a write command. Now, an interesting thing to note here is that a disk combiner does not have to use physical disks. The client here does not know whether he is looking at a virtual disk or a physical disk. So a disk combiner can be nested on top of other kind of virtual disks, a virtual disk with redundancy, for example. So even though this kind of system would increase the error rate of the combined disk, if these disks are have high robustness, then the combiner doesn't reduce the robustness by that much. Let's now look at an implementation of a disk combiner. Here I have an implementation of a disk combiner that takes about 100 lines of code. The code is split into 2. The first half computes the total size of the disk. This is the initialization phase of the disk combiner. So let's now see. It loops through the disks here and collects the sizes. So we can follow the total size over here. So the first disk is 100, The second disk adds 400 to 500, and the third disk adds another 200. So the total size is 700. Now the second half of the disk combiner performs the different actions that the client asks for. Let's see what the client asks for first. So the client asks for the size of the disk. So now we can simply return the computed total size of the disk, which is 700. The next time around, let's see what the client asks for. The client asks for a write. So now the disk combiner needs to compute the entry and the disk that it needs to write to. And for this, we have a separate function. Let's go into it. And this function simply subtracts the sizes of the different disks until the entry is within a certain disk. So let's see. Yeah, so it's in the third disk here. And the final entry number, let's see, is 10. Just like in the example we just covered. It then issues a write command to that disk for that entry. Let's see what it does in the third round. It issues a read. Now it wants to read the same as it just wrote to. It will compute which disk and which entry it is again, and perform the read operation. If you'd like to learn more about the 3 essential disk operations, check out the video in the description. Also, if you would like to see the code, I've added a link in the description. If you found this video interesting and would like to learn more, check out the book Foundations of Computer Science, available on Amazon.